Hi, Bethany here with Craft with Bethany, and on this week's video we're going to do something super fun, and that is a quilt kit. Have you ever done a quilt kit? If you're new to quilting, or maybe you've been quilting for a long time, sometimes a kit is just what you need to either get started, find your sojo again, or just need a break from some of those more challenging projects. So today we're going to be using this quilt kit. This is the Scrappy Grandma. This kit is from the Fabric Company. I'll link it below. I don't think they carry this one anymore. However, they have over 40 different quilt kits for you to choose from on their website, and they're always adding more, so definitely go check them out and pick out one that you like. But what I love about their quilt kits is it makes it very clear to pick one out based on your skill level and comfort level with quilting. So right here on the front of the instructions, it says easy, because this is an easy quilt kit because all of the pieces for this center part of the quilt are pre-cut for you in 10-inch squares, which is super awesome if you just want to like sit down and start sewing. I personally like to skip as much of the cutting as possible because it's just not my favorite part. I find it very tedious. Some people really find it therapeutic, so more power to you. But that's just not who I am, and that is totally fine. So something like this is exactly what I'm looking for. But they have a lot of different ones too. They have some intermediate ones and some more advanced ones as well. And they come in a variety of different fabrics, designs, seasons, patterns, you name it. What I do love about this quilt kit is it's pretty straightforward. Like I said, it's 10-inch squares. It's got a little sashing and a border, and that's it. Pretty easy, right? However, because it's so simple with this 10-inch squares, if I love how this turned out or how this came together, I could decide to make it again with my own fabric. So now that we've got our kit, let's open it up and see what's inside. All right, so the first thing that I pulled out is the card on the front that shows me what the front of the quilt will look like. So what you're getting is all the material to make the quilt top. It does not come with batting, and it does not come with the backing fabric, but it does come with everything else, including the binding, which is really nice. Not all quilt kits do that, so be sure you read to make sure you know exactly what you're getting, but I do love that they include the binding. All right, so it says here that I have 42 10-inch squares. This quilt will be 71 by 80 when finished, which it says right here at the front. So honestly, this is going to be probably one of the biggest quilts I've made, which I'm excited for. It has half a yard of my inner border, which is that kind of white sashing. It has 1 1/4 yard for the outer border, and then it has 3/4 yard for the binding. And then it recommends that I have 3 yards of 108-inch wide backing or 5 yards of 45-inch fabric. So backing fabric can come in a couple of different ways. You can do the 108-inch wide backing. They're typically solids that have maybe it's some sort of grain or color wave to them or something like that. And Fabric Company has a ton of 108 backings to choose from. But you can also use just regular 45-inch wide fabric, but you are going to have to sew pieces of that together to cover the entire back of your quilt. What's nice about the 108-inch wide backing is this will cover my entire quilt, and I don't have to piece anything together for the back. So I already picked out my backing fabric. It is set aside because I'm obviously not ready for it yet, but we're going to start with this. Now, on the back of this card, it has the instructions. So these are pretty straightforward because they are pre-cut. This would be a little more elaborate if I had to cut a bunch of pieces. But it basically tells me I do have to cut my inner border and my outer border strips. All of my squares are pre-cut, and it tells me how to assemble them. It tells me how to do my inner border and my outer border. And then that's all I need to know, right? So I guess for me, the biggest decision I have to make with this quilt is the pattern or the order I want my squares to go in. So here's all of my squares, and then these beautiful floral fabrics. I absolutely love this fabric. So we've got the squares. There's my inner border, and my outer border is a printed kind of design, kind of combining all of these together. Super fun, super cute. All right, so I guess what I need to start with, setting aside these two fabrics, because I'm not ready for those yet. And I guess just figuring out the order that I want to do these in. Now, they have photos on the front, and you could probably try to match these and do the same order if you want, but honestly, it's up to you. So each person's quilt could look a little different. So what I'm probably going to start with is separating. There's multiple squares of each print, and I'm probably going to separate those. So then I can go, okay, how many different prints do I have? How many of each print? And come up with a game plan. Because the last thing I want is them right next to each other. I really want this to kind of have a patchwork look, and it's going to be fun. Okay, so clearly I'm running out of counter space here, so I want to finagle some things. But one thing I'm looking at is I'm going to have 7 rows of 6. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 squares across, and there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 rows of 6 squares. So what I'm probably going to do is lay out my 6 and then lay out another 6 and lay out another 6 until I find the right dimension. And then since there's 2, there appears to be 2 of every color, I'm going to just kind of repeat that, but then I could always flip the row over so it's kind of going in the opposite direction. So it's not like repetitive. I don't know, in my head that makes sense. What would be really nice is a design wall where you can, if you've never heard of a design wall, it's basically where you put either batting, or some people will get like the dollar store, like the plastic reusable tablecloths that have like the felt, like the fleecy stuff on one side and they're like plastic on the other side. Well, if you hang that plastic side to your wall and you have that fuzzy side, these will stick to that. So you can kind of like place and move or whatever. And that would be a great option too. Another option is just to go to a bigger room, like my living room, and move the coffee table and lay them out on the floor, which I might actually do. It's not a bad idea because I don't want my blocks, like I've got some very prominent blues and I don't want those, and here's another one, I don't want those like right next to each other. So I'm trying to be strategic, but also like it's patchwork, so it's okay if it's not perfect. But it's gonna be fun. This whole thing's supposed to be fun. Like these 2 prints right here are the same print in just a different colorway. I really don't want those right next to each other. And these 2 are the same. These 2 are the same. These 2 are the same, but they're just different colorways. So I really do need to kind of be a little strategic. Like these 2 are the same. I'm starting to see these 2 are the same. So I need to kind of lay these out. So I think that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go lay them out on my living room floor. And then once I have them all laid out in the order that I want, I will stack them in rows so I know what order to sew them in. So that's what I'm going to do. So once I have my stacks for each row, I'll come back and we'll start putting this together because I want to show you just how quick and easy this is. This is honestly the hardest part is just picking out which order my squares are going to go in. And I'm going to have some fun doing that. So I'm going to go in there, figure that out, and I'll come right back. Okay, so I have figured out my order of my squares. It took me a minute in my living room and I just laid out all the matching prints and just kept finagling them until I was happy with it. So I didn't have any similar colors right next to each other or matching prints right next to each other. And so now what I did is I had them all laid out on my floor and then I stacked them in order that I'm going to sew them together. So this is my first row. This is my second row, this is my third row, and so on. All right, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take my first row, and the way that I did this is the piece on top is that left corner piece. So if you're looking at the quilt, it's this piece right here, and then it goes across that way, like you would read a book. So this is my first piece, and this is my second piece. So I'm going to lay them right sides together and sew down this side so that they will open up like this. Once I open it, I will take this piece, put it on top, do my 1/4 inch seam allowance, and continue to build this entire row all the way across. Now, it is important that if you're new to quilting that you do use a 1/4 inch seam. If you do not have a 1/4 inch piecing foot, I highly recommend getting one for your machine. If you don't have one, that's okay. You don't need it to get started, but I would recommend measuring a 1/4 inch from your center needle position over to the right, and maybe taking a little piece of painter's tape or washi tape and putting that where the 1/4 inch mark or 1/4 inch seam would be, so that way you can line up the edge of your fabric with that tape so you're consistently getting a 1/4 inch seam every time. That's one of the most important things about quilting, is that you're using the same seam allowance consistently as you're building your quilt so that it comes together and is a nice finished square or rectangle shape. And so that's why it's really important that you make sure you're using the right seam allowance. Of course, all of that is told you right here on these instructions. All right, so I'm actually going to go over to my FOF machine. I just got a new clear quilting table added to my machine, so I'm really excited. This is the perfect project to take it for a test drive because I have not used that new quilting table yet, extension table, so this is the perfect project to do that. And so I'm going to go over here and start sewing my pieces together, and I'll show you the first row when I'm done. Okay, so I have my first row completed. All right, so I went from this end to this end, and I'm going to take it to my iron and I'm going to press open my seams. I like to press them open so that each side is kind of open this way. Some people like to press to one side. A lot of people will press to the darker fabric, but since all of these fabrics are kind of on the darker side and are very busy, it's totally fine. I'm going to press them open because I'm going to be attaching different rows to each other, and it'll just make it easier when I get to those seams to line up my lines, my seams. All right, so I'm going to press this, and then I'm going to take my next stack of 6 squares and sew those together, and when I get those sewn together, then we'll sew these 2 rows together so you can learn how to do that.
Okay, so for some reason my microphone stopped working at this point in the recording, but it's only for a couple of minutes, so bear with me as I record some voiceover so you can understand what I'm explaining. But I apologize that the voice that you're hearing and the mouth that you're watching on screen does not match up. I don't know what happened. Anyways, so I completed the first 2 rows, and what I'm going to do next is take the top row and place it right sides together on top of the second row, and just lay them across, line them up. And I want to align my seam allowances from the first row to the second row together, and I'm going to use straight pins to attach these together. So before I wasn't using straight pins to sew all the blocks together in a row because I didn't really need to. You can if you want to, but when it comes to this and you're starting to build your quilt row by row, you're going to want to use straight pins. And I like to put a pin through the center of the seam of one row and then through the center of the seam of the next row to make sure that they stay aligned. So the only pinning I'm going to do is through the seams of each block of each row so that they're aligned together. Once I get them all pinned all the way across, I'm then going to sew those 2 together across that side all the way down, 1/4 inch seam allowance, the same seam allowance we use for adding the blocks to build the rows. So I'm going to go down both sides, or both sides of the center. I always start pinning in the center and work my way out, but that's just me. You can pin it however you like, but I'm going to go do each one, sew them together, and then we'll come back and open them up and show you what they look like now that we've added rows. This is when your quilt really starts to take shape and come together and really kind of get a feel for what it's going to look like. Okay, so now my first 2 rows are sewn together. I'm going to hold it up and show it to you. This is really starting to come together quickly and super fast. I already ironed all of my seams open, so I butterflied, ironed, and pressed my seams open on the back so they lay nice and flat, and it just helps prevent bulk, making quilting it later so much easier. I am going to continue working on the rows, and as I finish a row, I'm going to add it to the quilt. That way I don't get them mixed up in my process. So again, keeping that photo of how you planned your layout of your quilt pieces on your phone that you saw me share earlier in the video, that photo is my reference to make sure that I'm still going in the order that I had originally planned. And that's going to help me stay on track, and I'll continue to build out my quilt. Okay, so just like TV magic, I have finished adding all of my rows to my quilt, and it is finished. And so the next thing I need to do after I've pressed it all and it's set aside, I need to start planning out my sashing and my border. So the sashing is that inner border, and then I have an outer border. So basically it's the inner border, outer border. So the inner border is a white, solid white that goes around and frames the quilt. And then the outer border is that patchwork hexy fabric that's going to go around outside of that white border. But what I need to do first is look at the instructions and trim down or cut down my fabric, which I've already done here. I used my ruler, my rotary cutter, and I cut my 2.5-inch wide strips in the white, and I'm using those same 2.5-inch wide strips to do that inner border as well as the binding when I'm done quilting. And then the outside border, the outer border of this hexy fabric is 5-inch wide. So I went ahead and cut those strips. So what I need to do next is take my strips of the white, and I'm going to sew a couple together because I'm going to need more than one strip to get across one side of the quilt to add the border. So I'm going to sew my strips together to build one long enough that goes across each side and the top and the bottom to basically frame in my quilt top. Something to note is if you're doing this method of adding these borders, there's a couple of ways that you can do it. But for this one, I did the sides first, so the longer sides first, and I did one on each side, a strip on each side, and then I trim it off to make sure it's in alignment with the top and the bottom of the quilt, and then I added my top and bottom border to really give me that nice framed in look. You'll see what I'm talking about when I start adding these pieces together, and I repeat that same method for the outside border even though it's bigger than the inner border. Okay, so here I am talking about this again, and I bring this picture up a little closer so you can see that these borders, I do the sides first, and then I do the tops and bottoms because they go all the way across. And that way I'm consistent with both my inner border and my outer border, so they have kind of matching seams or styles, and they're not mixed match. So again, it's totally up to you, but this is what I chose to do to kind of match the recommendation on the quilt kit that I purchased.
Right, so one thing I meant to mention, but I wanted to give a second to do this, is my strips that I've cut are not the length of my quilt. So I actually am going to sew a few of these strips together, and there's a couple of ways you can do that. You can just straight sew and have a straight line, which is totally fine. And I will probably do that on this quilt just because everything else is straight line. You could also do a diagonal and have it go that way and open up. It's totally personal preference. Normally I would do the diagonal, but because everything else is straight line and how these are joining in the corners is straight line instead of mitered corners, I'm going to go with a straight line. So I'm going to attach at least 2 of these. I think 2 of these would get me all the way across the longest part of my quilt. And then I can attach that down that side, and I'll do the same for the other side. And then I'll probably need to attach two, even though it'll be extra, to go across the top and the bottom. Even though they're shorter, they're definitely wider than this. And so we'll have a couple of extra seams, but because it's white, you're not really going to notice it. And that's totally fine. All right, so I'm going to piece these together, attach, and I'll come back. Okay, so I got the sashing, or the inner border, on both long sides of my quilt, and so I took it to the iron, and because this is white, I did press everything towards the squares so that it is hidden. If I had pressed my seam towards the white, you would be able to see it through, and we don't want that, so it's all pressed towards the darker color, which is the squares. And now that I've pressed it, I can see right here that my piece is too long. I definitely cut them a little on the longer side just to be safe, and so I need to cut right here so it's in alignment with the edge of this quilt with these squares, so that I can attach my next strip down the top and bottom. So I'm going to grab my ruler because I want to make sure it's straight. Here we go. So I trim off my excess, and now I can attach my next piece and stitch this down. Now, one thing I want to note that I didn't note earlier is I do have seams here on these strips, and one thing that I did was line up that seam with an existing seam on my quilt. And what I mean by that is, here is this seam right here, and I lined it up with the seam of my quilt, these squares. So yes, there's going to be a seam down the side on these and across the bottom and top, but I'm going to line it up with an existing seam so it's not off right here or over here in a weird spot. And then since I had long enough strips, I was able to do that, and it worked out great. So it's just an idea, if you end up with that, to kind of hide it in a sense, is to keep it in alignment with the other lines so it just kind of gets lost and your eye's not drawn to it being misplaced. All right, so I'm going to finish the sashing, and then we'll come back for the outer border. All right, so I've got all of my inner border, or my sashing, attached all the way around, and I trimmed off the excess so I have perfectly square corners. And now I'm going to take my 5-inch wide border pieces and do the exact same thing. Again, these are not going to be long enough to go all the way across my quilt, and it'll be like this. So I am going to have to attach a couple together to get across both lengths of the quilt, but I'm going to do the same method where I go across this way and trim, and then I'll go all the way across that way, and I'll end up with another square corner just like that, but with this wider 5-inch. Once I'm done with this and my entire quilt top is done, I'm ready to make my quilt sandwich with my batting, my backing, quilt it however I decide, and then do my binding in the same white, and I'll be done. So we're at the home stretch of this. Again, the squares make it go really fast. This is really easy as well, so just have fun with it. This is why I love doing these quilt kits. All right, so here is my finished quilt top. Now all I have to do is add my batting and my backing and quilt it however I want, and then trim those edges and add my binding, and I'm done. I haven't quite decided how I'm going to quilt this yet. Part of me wants to do the easy way and just straight line quilt it, but I've always wanted to try quilting with my embroidery machine, and I have some really big hoops that would make it pretty easy. So I'm thinking I might go that route, because this was such a quick make that I feel like this is a good one to test that on. So I think I'm going to try that when I'm feeling up to it. It's a little nerve-wracking to try, but I want to practice on a quilt top that I didn't spend a ton of time on. And these are the perfect kind of quilts to do that with. So I think I'm going to go watch some YouTube videos, quite like this one, and figure out how to do that. So then maybe if I master it, I can come back and share that with you guys in another video. But I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please like and subscribe. If you're not following me on Instagram, you absolutely should be, because I post so much content over there as well. But be sure to come back next Friday for another wonderful sewing video or crafting video or whatever I end up sharing with you. And I hope you enjoyed this. Happy sewing!